Welcome to Identity Verification. This is Elliot Maris, the editor of Kiosk Marketplace, and I would like to introduce Michael Blute from Thales Group. He is the Global Marketing Manager for Document Readers. Thales Group is a global company with over 80,000 employees and 19 billion euros in sales in 2019. Michael, why is document verification important?
Document verification is something that we're all used to. For example, when clearing customs, purchasing even an automobile where you still have to provide an ID, obtaining a boarding pass at a self-service kiosk for an international flight, for example. But in today's environment of COVID-19, contact tracing is pushing ID verification forward. An example, underage person who is infected goes to a bar with a fake ID. Now, looking strictly at the contact tracing element, this becomes a dead end since there's no traceability because the document used is fake. It is critical in this instance that the ID is verified and that it is authentic. Regulatory requirements are also pushing ID verification to the forefront in more and more sectors. And the need for ID verification, for example, for registering in a hotel, or even doing a visit to a secure environment such as a power plant or even an airport for someone coming in to do a repair, ID verification is critical because we need to ensure that the individuals coming are who they say they are and that they're actually having an ID that can be traced back to them. And regulatory requirements are also pushing this to the forefront. And lastly, we need to address the issue of fraud. With fraudsters becoming much more sophisticated, ID verification, especially physical ID verification, is becoming key. And all of that is to ensure that the ID is valid. And this is just, the image that I'm showing is actually a real image of the extent of the problem. And this was one custom seizure of 20,000 fake IDs that landed at a single airport in the US. And that's why ID verification is becoming much more critical in this day and age.
Wow. All right. Well, can you provide some insight on the type of commercial client who needs this solution?
Absolutely, Elliot. Commercial clients can range from organizations who provide goods and services. Goods can range from consumer electronics to even vehicles purchased and fashion. Services can range, for example, from financial services to a hotel check-in. And background checks and visitor management are other key areas. Example for background checks can be new hires. We need to ensure that contract workers or even employees are legitimate and that they have the ability to actually work in the environment. Visitor management, and need to know who is coming onto the premise, is becoming more critical. Even with industrial espionage, you need to make sure that a visitor is tracked, and both incoming and leaving. And in addition to that, it is also important and to adhere to privacy laws that individual's information is no longer in an open binder that everyone can see who's coming and going in that organization. And of course, critical infrastructure is a must for ID verification, just namely for the security environments that you're going into.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, could you outline a client deployment?
I can. A typical deployment consists of either an unintended scenario or what we call an attended scenario. An unintended scenario would be a self-serve kiosk. In this type of environment, a visitor or a client would insert an ID, which is then scanned. And all of the security points on that ID are inspected and compared to a library of government IDs. And these libraries tend to focus globally so that if you have a visitor from another country, you can be assured that ID is still authentic. And I always like to look at it is that it's always easy when we take a look at our home state or our home country, we can identify those IDs. But if we have someone that's a foreigner coming in and all of a sudden, for example, their license has changed, and actually I had this happen to myself where I rented an automobile and all of a sudden the facility dealt with a lot of international travelers. So they were familiar with what my license would look like. What they were not familiar with was what the new license looked like, which had just been issued that month. And that caused a little bit of a headache for me. The other option, of course, is the facial check, which can also be included. And this takes it to another level. So not only is the document inspected on all the different aspects, and you can kind of see that in the image here as well. So we actually look at it in infrared, ultraviolet, and it shows up different items that come up or that appear under the different light spectrums. And of course, also in the clear. But we can add that an option, as I've mentioned, which is called facial check, which is also available through Thales. And in that instance, what we do is we actually inspect the chip on the card or on the document, and we compare that to the image that could be on the document itself. And we can even go to another level where we not only inspect the image from the chip onto the document, but then also compare it to the individual that is standing in front of us. And the result of that is that the ID verification at the end can be uploaded to the client's back end. And that would be utilized leveraging either our SDK or form filling software so that it's easily populated into whatever application they need for record purposes.
Well, what is the difference between online document verification and on-premise verification?
It's a very good question. And online verification is a great process, and it's something that I think a lot of the members in the audience would be used to, and they probably would go through this type of a system when they're doing their online banking. And the inspection here is only done on the visual, so it's not as comprehensive, and that is really where the difference outlines. So in a visual inspection, you're only seeing the clear. And a great example of that is, for example, if you go to a grocery store, any store, or in this instance, a liquor store, and you're buying a great bottle of wine, but you pay cash, and all of a sudden you give that individual a $50, $100 bill, or even a 20. And they, sometimes you'll see them and they're looking in the light to see if, they can determine if it's fake or not. They really can't. And the same thing happens when you're doing a clear inspection of a clear light inspection of a document, right? You don't see all those security features because they're just not available to the naked eye. And that is solved by actually having a physical document reader on premise. And this one is actually really interesting because one of the things that is really important with all this type of technology is that the customer actually feels less of a pain point. So in this instance, the ID is dropped in and it's scanned on both sides simultaneously within seconds. And remember earlier, I mentioned about COVID-19 being an issue, and a lot of people are very frightened of that. And those that are, in this instance, the customer could literally drop it in and it's automatically scanned. The information is automatically captured for the retailer in this instance. And the interesting thing is once it's done the read, it actually pops up just like a toaster, and you can actually just pull it out. The only difference is that with a toaster, when you touch hot bread, you might burn your fingers. In this instance, all you're doing is you're grabbing your own license back without having anyone else touch it, and only the consumer is touching that license.
Well, how does ID verification help frontline workers?
So frontline workers are responsible for checking, and the interesting thing is that they're not taught how to identify fake IDs, but the responsibility is placed on them to check and validate the customer's ID. So in order to automate this system, we're removing that burden from the frontline employee. And that becomes actually quite critical. So I talked a little bit earlier about, checking the cash to see if it's, if it's real or not by holding it up to the light. Having an employee do that, when there's a high value purchase that is occurring, or if it's around a regulatory requirement, that puts a lot of pressure on that frontline worker. And what we're really doing by automating this is we're removing that burden from the frontline worker. And the organization is then able to automate the process and ensure that all the ID security features are A, checked, two, or B, verified, and that the document is authentic. And ultimately that it's not a fraudulent ID. The data capturing in the scenario is 100%. So you're not going to have any spelling mistakes. So the accuracy is paramount in this type of solution, which is also critical for the company or the organization. And ultimately, it leads to a much better customer experience because it's actually faster. And because it's faster, you're able to process the customers faster, it also leads to better staff utilization.
Is there intensive training required for frontline workers to start using the system?
There is not, and the reason there isn't is that we need to keep it simple. Depending upon where the frontline worker is located, people can move around a lot. So if you have, if you have high turnover, it would mean a lot of intensive regimental training. If it's simple, you're able to avoid that. So the solution provided by Thales is designed for ease of use. The ID scan, for example, started once the document is placed in the reader or on the reader. And it can even be a mobile phone. And if someone is using a mobile phone, so some of the states and some countries are moving toward mobile driver's licenses, for example, and those driver's licenses are on a mobile phone. And they don't even need to place the phone on the document reader at that instance. So it's a little bit of a different document reader. So it would have like it'd be like almost like a photocopier type screen. So there's a glass rather than this one where you insert it. But you can actually have that phone even in night mode. So it can be completely dark. And as long as that license is on that phone, even in dark mode, we're able to scan that and obtain all that information and verify that it is authentic. The simplicity is key while providing the true mechanism to identify both authentic documents and those that are suspect or fraudulent. And when I say suspect, a suspect document would be one where all of the security checks are there. So everything is valid with the exception of one. And a great example of a suspect would be all of a sudden the document is expired. So it identifies that and it actually alerts the user that it has been flagged, but because everything else is fine and everything matches up, you could still let that go, but that becomes a corporate policy at that point. The solution needs to be easy for frontline workers while simultaneously providing a seamless customer journey through the process.
All right. Well, can ID verification be used in a self-service environment? And how easy is it for a client to use the system?
The answer is yes, and ID verification can be used in self-service environments. In today's environment, customers want to take charge, and that's why we're seeing such a proliferation of kiosks, because the user takes control of, in a way, of or manages their own destiny. Kiosks also provide a better staff utilization. So again, going to a hospital example or a hospitality, self-check-in is becoming very dominant because people are getting off on long flights. They want to get into their hotel room, and a kiosk provides a great avenue for them to get in and check in and then get to their room, unpack, and go and do whatever they have to do. And, a great example is, Elliot, I mean, I'm sure we've all traveled, and I've gone through LAX numerous times. And then when I check in at the hotel, irregardless of the time, there's always a massive lineup. And I don't think it matters which hotel it is, if you're checking in close to the airport. And I suspect that's very true for all airports around the world.
Well, in closing, Michael, what in your view is the biggest benefit to clients adopting ID verification with document readers?
The biggest benefit is the assurance that the holder of the document matches and that it is authentic. This helps cut down on economic crime. And so the benefits are a reduction in fraud, meeting regulatory requirements, while providing an opportunity for better staff utilization. I think that really sums up the three big items why this type of technology is so adoptable.
Michael, thank you so much for your time. It was very helpful. This has been Identity Verification. Thank you all for joining us.